40 Chinese naval vessels are in the water right now, and they are not conducting a routine patrol. They are in a deliberate encirclement formation. A layered ring of destroyers, frigates, corvettes, submarines, and Coast Guard cutters spread across 140 nautical miles of contested South China Sea, closing inward from 5 separate compass headings toward a single point at the center of that ring. That point is the USS Ronald Reagan, a Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier operating with its strike group in international waters approximately 220 nautical miles southwest of the Philippine island of Palawan. And then the trap snapped shut. The Reagan did not turn north toward the Philippine Sea. It did not execute the high-speed breakout that American carrier doctrine prescribes when surface contact density exceeds safe operational parameters. It did not call for the immediate repositioning of the 2 Los Angeles-class submarines that American doctrine always positions within 50 nautical miles of a deployed carrier. Instead, its commanding officer made a decision that no Chinese naval war planner, no planned fleet commander, and no PLA strategic analyst had fully gamed in any simulation exercise at the Naval Command College in Nanjing. He stopped the carrier group completely, and he waited. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why stopping was the right answer when 40 warships closed around an American carrier. You are going to understand why the specific formation geometry China chose revealed the single most critical vulnerability in the plan's anti-carrier strategy, a vulnerability that China has spent 30 years and $300 billion trying to hide. You are going to understand what happened beneath the surface of the South China Sea during the 19 hours that the Reagan held its position, and why those 19 hours produced more actionable American intelligence on Chinese naval warfighting doctrine than the previous 5 years of satellite surveillance combined. And you are going to understand why the most significant naval encounter in the Pacific since World War II ended not with a shot fired, not with a ship damaged, not with a diplomatic incident, but with 40 Chinese warships quietly reversing course and sailing home. Let us get straight into the details. The South China Sea is not a body of water. It is a strategic choke point through which approximately $3.4 trillion of global trade transits every single year. It is the primary maritime corridor connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, connecting the oil fields of the Persian Gulf to the factories of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. It is the body of water that China has spent the last 15 years militarizing with artificial island bases, anti-ship missile batteries, and naval air stations built on top of reefs that, under international maritime law, belong to no nation at all. It is also the body of water that the United States Navy has been sailing through, operating in, and conducting freedom of navigation operations across for 75 years. Not because the United States claims the South China Sea, but because the principle that international waters remain international, that no nation can close an ocean to the commerce and military vessels of another, is the foundational rule of the global order that American military power has enforced since 1945. That principle and China's territorial ambitions are on a direct collision course. And the USS Ronald Reagan, 1,092 feet long, displacing 104,000 tons of water, carrying 90 aircraft and 5,000 personnel, is the physical object around which that collision is organized. To understand what 40 Chinese warships surrounding a carrier means, you first need to understand what a carrier strike group actually is, and what it is designed to survive. The USS Ronald Reagan does not sail alone. It sails inside a layered defensive architecture that the United States Navy has refined across 8 decades of blue water operations. That architecture, on a standard deployment, consists of 1 or 2 Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers positioned within 3 nautical miles of the carrier, providing inner-zone air defense. 2 to 4 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers operating in an outer defensive ring at 10 to 25 nautical miles, providing anti-submarine, anti-surface, and extended air defense coverage. 1 to 2 fast attack submarines operating at classified positions within 50 nautical miles. Invisible, silent, and capable of destroying any surface vessel in the contact picture within minutes. A carrier air wing of 90 aircraft conducting constant combat air patrols, maritime patrol, airborne early warning, and electronic surveillance at ranges exceeding 300 nautical miles from the carrier itself. And a dedicated combat logistics force of replenishment ships ensuring the strike group can sustain operations without returning to port for months. This is not a ship. This is a moving, floating, sovereign piece of American military power projection, capable of dominating an area of ocean the size of France, and 40 Chinese warships surrounded it. On the surface, that sounds like an overwhelming show of force, 40 ships against 1 carrier group. The numbers seem unambiguous. The visual of 40 vessels closing a ring around the most powerful naval asset in history seems like it tells its own story. But the numbers are exactly where the story becomes more complicated than it appears. And understanding why requires understanding what China has actually been trying to solve with those 40 ships, and why the solution it chose revealed the problem it was trying to hide. Let us break down the encirclement formation China deployed, because the specific composition of those 40 vessels tells us exactly what China was attempting to demonstrate, and what it inadvertently demonstrated instead. The outer ring consisted of 8 Type 052D Luoyang III class guided missile destroyers and 4 Type 54A Zhangkai II class frigates, deployed in a 140 nautical mile diameter circle around the carrier group. These are China's frontline surface combatants. The Type 052D carries 64 vertical launch system cells capable of firing the YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missile, the HHQ-9 long-range surface-to-air missile, and the CY-5 anti-submarine rocket. These ships are competent, modern, and capable. They form the backbone of planned surface warfare doctrine. The middle ring consisted of 6 Type 056A Zhongdao-class corvettes and 4 China Coast Guard vessels, the CGC ships marking a deliberate choice to insert a nominally civilian law enforcement asset into a military encirclement formation. We will return to that choice because it matters enormously. The inner observation ring, the most operationally aggressive element of the formation, consisted of 2 Type 055 Renhai-class cruisers. The Type 055 is China's most capable surface combatant. It displaces 12,000 tons, carries 112 VLS cells, and represents the first Chinese surface vessel that American naval analysts genuinely assess as a peer competitor to the Ticonderoga-class cruiser. Positioning 2 Type 055s inside the encirclement formation, inside the defensive ring of the carrier group, was not an accident. It was a message. China was telling the United States Navy, we can put our best ships where your best ships are. And beneath the surface, Chinese maritime patrol aircraft and signals intelligence aircraft were holding position at 80 nautical miles from the carrier, mapping every electromagnetic emission the Reagan's strike group produced, every radar frequency, every communication protocol, every active sonar ping, every data link transmission. This is what 40 ships surrounding a carrier actually accomplishes, not a physical trap. An intelligence collection operation at a scale and proximity that no satellite pass, no shore-based sensor, and no distant surveillance aircraft can replicate. China was not trying to sink the USS Ronald Reagan. China was trying to read it. Now let us talk about what the Reagan's commanding officer understood the moment the encirclement formation achieved its full geometry. Because the decision to stop to hold position rather than execute the breakout was not a passive decision. It was an active one. And it was based on something the encirclement formation revealed the moment it reached its full extent. The formation had a gap, not a physical gap. The contact density around the carrier was genuine, but a procedural gap, a timing gap. A gap in the coordination architecture of the encirclement that became visible the moment all 40 vessels reached their assigned positions, and the planned fleet commander transmitted the order, confirming formation complete. That transmission was not invisible. The Reagan's ANSLQ-32 electronic warfare system and the cruisers' and destroyers' own electronic intelligence suites captured every element of the plan's fleet coordination communication in those 19 hours. The frequency architecture, the command hierarchy implied by which vessels transmitted and which received, the timing intervals between coordination updates, the specific protocols the plan used to pass targeting data between its outer ring destroyers, its inner Type 055 cruisers, and the maritime patrol aircraft holding at 80 miles. The Reagan did not stop because it was trapped. The Reagan stopped because stopping was the best possible way to read the book that 40 Chinese warships had just opened and left on the table. Here's the part that every piece of coverage of this encounter gets wrong. And it gets it wrong because it is asking the wrong question. The question everyone asks is whether 40 Chinese warships could sink a U.S. carrier strike group. That question is dramatic. It generates clicks. It fills comment sections with arguments between people who have read Tom Clancy novels and people who have read Jane's Fighting Ships. It is also entirely the wrong question. The right question is this: what does it cost China to put 40 warships in the South China Sea simultaneously? And what did the United States learn about that cost in 19 hours of watching China pay it? The answer to that question changes everything about how you understand this encounter. China's anti-carrier strategy is built around a concept called anti-access area denial, A2AD. The theory is straightforward. You do not need to defeat a carrier strike group in a naval battle if you can make the operating environment so dangerous, so saturated with threats, that the carrier cannot get close enough to a conflict zone to matter. You build ballistic missiles that can hit a moving carrier at 1,500 kilometers, the DF-21D, the so-called carrier killer. You build submarine fleets designed to operate in the shallow, acoustically complex waters of the first island chain. You build shore-based aircraft with anti-ship missiles that can strike from the Chinese coastline without ever exposing a surface ship. The surface fleet encirclement is not the primary A2AD weapon. It is the demonstration weapon. It is the element designed to be seen, to signal to the American carrier commander, to the American public, to the governments of the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, and Australia, that China can physically surround a carrier group, and there's nothing the United States can do about it. Except there is something. And the Reagan's commanding officer demonstrated it with 19 hours of calculated stillness. Here is what the encirclement revealed that China did not intend to reveal. 40 surface ships produce an enormous acoustic signature. 40 ships running propulsion systems, active sonar, radar arrays, communication equipment, and aviation support systems produce a combined electromagnetic and acoustic environment that is not a threat to a carrier group's submarines. It is a gift to them. The 2 Los Angeles-class fast attack submarines holding position within the Reagan's defensive perimeter did not attempt to evade the 40-ship encirclement. They used it. Every active sonar ping that Chinese anti-submarine frigates transmitted to search for American submarines gave those submarines a precise acoustic fingerprint of the Chinese vessel that transmitted it. Every propulsion noise signature produced by 40 ships operating in a confined geographic area was cataloged, analyzed, and added to an acoustic library that American submarines will use to identify and track those specific Chinese vessels for the next decade. China sent 40 ships to demonstrate it could find and surround an American carrier. What it actually demonstrated was that it cannot hide 40 ships from 2 American submarines. That asymmetry is not marginal. It is foundational. Because the fundamental question of any anti-carrier operation is not whether you can see the carrier. Carriers are enormous. They produce massive radar, infrared, and acoustic signatures. You can always find a carrier. The fundamental question is whether you can execute an attack sequence. Find, fix, track, target, engage, assess before the carrier's defensive systems, and more importantly, before the carrier's submarines execute their own attack sequence against you. And 40 Chinese surface ships in a 140 nautical mile ring around the Reagan gave American submarine commanders the most comprehensive targeting data on planned surface warfare vessels that any American submarine crew has ever collected in a non-combat environment. China set a trap. The trap snapped shut on China. Now let us talk about what this encirclement means for the broader strategic situation in the South China Sea. Because the naval encounter is the visible surface of a shift in Chinese strategic posture that has been building for 2 years, and that this encounter has now made impossible to ignore. China's decision to deploy 40 warships in an encirclement formation around an American carrier did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the context of 3 specific developments that together explain why Beijing decided that the diplomatic cost of this demonstration was worth paying. The first development is the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement between the United States and the Philippines. Since 2023, the United States has gained access to 4 additional Philippine military bases, 2 of them in the northern Philippines, directly facing the Taiwan Strait. These bases give American forces the ability to operate closer to any Taiwan contingency than at any point since the closure of Clark Air Base in Subic Bay in 1992. China has watched this access expansion with a strategic alarm that its public statements significantly understate. The encirclement was partly a message to Manila that alignment with Washington carries visible military costs that the Philippine government needs to explain to its own population. The second development is the trilateral security partnership between the United States, Japan, and the Philippines that formalized in early 2024. Japan's decision to double its defense budget and acquire 400 Tomahawk cruise missiles, American-made, capable of striking targets on the Chinese mainland from Japanese territory, changed the threat calculus for Beijing in a way that no Chinese strategic planner had fully anticipated. The encirclement was partly a message to Tokyo. We can still project force into the waters that separate your island chain from the South China Sea. Your Tomahawks do not make your ships immune. The third development is the one that Beijing will not say publicly, but that every action it has taken in the South China Sea in the last 18 months reflects. China knows that its window for uncontested military action in the region is closing. Not because American forces are growing. The United States military has faced budget constraints, readiness challenges, and strategic distraction across multiple theaters, but because the regional coalition that American power anchors is growing. The Philippines, Japan, Australia, and India are each independently increasing defense spending, improving interoperability with American forces, and acquiring capabilities specifically designed to complicate Chinese military planning. The encirclement was not just a demonstration of Chinese naval power. It was a deadline announcement. China was telling every nation in the region, we are still the dominant military force in this water. Align with us while alignment is still an option. The window in which you choose wisely is not unlimited. The decision that the Reagan's commanding officer made, to stop, to hold, to collect, was not just a tactical decision. It was a strategic response to that deadline announcement. It said, We see what you are telling the region, and we are showing the region something different. We are showing them that the tool you built your deadline announcement around, the surface fleet, the encirclement, the visible show of force, produces more intelligence value for us than threat value for you. China wanted the image of 40 warships surrounding an American carrier to be the defining visual of its South China Sea strategy. The Reagan's commanding officer converted that image into a 19-hour intelligence collection operation and then sailed away. Let us now address what this encounter means for the nations whose entire economic existence runs through the body of water where it happened, because the South China Sea is not a geopolitical abstraction for the 600 million people who live along its coastlines. Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia collectively have overlapping territorial claims with China across the South China Sea. That China's 9-dash line, its unilateral claim to approximately 90% of the sea's area, dismisses entirely. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea ruled China's 9-dash line illegal in 2016. China ignored the ruling. The reason China can ignore a binding international legal ruling is the same reason the encirclement happened: naval power. 40 warships surrounding an American carrier in international waters is also a message to every Vietnamese fishing boat, every Filipino Coast Guard vessel, every Malaysian oil platform operating in water that international law says is theirs, and Chinese military power says is Beijing's. The message is, the law says one thing: we have 40 ships, you have fishing boats. Choose which one governs your behavior. The economic stakes of that choice are not abstract. The South China Sea contains an estimated 125 billion barrels of oil and approximately 500 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. These are not theoretical reserves. They are resources that the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia have been trying to develop for decades, drilling programs that Chinese Coast Guard vessels have physically blocked, boarded, and in some cases destroyed, using water cannons, laser dazzlers, and direct ram techniques against civilian vessels. The 4 China Coast Guard ships in the encirclement formation were not present by accident. They were present because China has developed a doctrine of using civilian law enforcement vessels for actions that would constitute acts of war if conducted by naval vessels. A Coast Guard ship ramming a Filipino resupply boat is a law enforcement action. A planned destroyer ramming a Filipino resupply boat is an act of war. The legal distinction is real. The physical damage to the Filipino boat is identical. By embedding Coast Guard vessels in a naval encirclement formation, China was also testing whether the United States would treat the civilian-designated vessels differently than the naval vessels. The Reagan's commanding officer did not differentiate. Every vessel in the formation, naval, Coast Guard, maritime militia, was tracked, cataloged, and added to the intelligence picture with equal precision. Now let us talk about what this encounter means for global shipping insurance and the commodity markets that respond to South China Sea tension, because the economic ripple effects of Chinese naval aggression in that waterway affect prices on store shelves in countries that most people cannot locate on a map. Approximately 60% of global liquefied natural gas trade transits the South China Sea. Approximately 30% of global crude oil trade transits the South China Sea. When Chinese naval activity in those waters reaches a level that Lloyd's of London risk assessors classify as elevated, which the encirclement of an American carrier absolutely does, shipping insurance premiums for vessels transiting the area increase. When insurance premiums increase, shipping costs increase. When shipping costs increase, the price of everything those ships carry increases. The LNG that Japan imports to heat homes and generate electricity becomes more expensive. The crude oil that South Korean refineries process into gasoline and diesel becomes more expensive. The consumer electronics, the automotive components, the pharmaceutical ingredients that move through those waters become more expensive at the point of sale. In cities and towns thousands of miles from the South China Sea, for families who have never heard of the USS Ronald Reagan and will never know that 40 Chinese warships once surrounded it. This is the weapon that China wields without firing a missile. Uncertainty in the South China Sea is itself a commodity that prices itself into every ship that sails through it. In every escalation, every encirclement, every ram, every laser, every water cannon attack adds to the uncertainty premium that the global economy pays whether or not a shot is ever fired. The plan's response to this encounter will not be visible immediately. It will not be announced. But it will show up in 3 specific places over the next 12 to 24 months, and understanding where to look will tell you more about the trajectory of this conflict than any number of official Defense Ministry statements. First, watch the Type 0-525 deployment pattern. The 2 Renhai-class cruisers that entered the inner ring of the encirclement formation were doing something unprecedented. They were operating inside the defensive perimeter of a carrier strike group, at ranges where American defensive systems could have engaged them without warning. The plan commanders who authorized that positioning accepted real risk to learn what American defensive responses looked like at that proximity. Watch whether China positions Type 055 cruisers at that range again. If it does, it has confidence in the data it collected. If it does not, the data it collected was a warning, not a confirmation. Second, watch the submarine deployment that accompanies the next large-scale planned South China Sea exercise. China currently deploys its Type 039 Song class and Type 039A Wen class submarines in the South China Sea in a defensive posture, protecting approaches to the Chinese coastline and the artificial island bases. If the intelligence China collected during the encirclement shows that American submarines inside the carrier group's defensive perimeter are more capable, more numerous, and operating closer than planners anticipated, China's response will be to increase its offensive submarine presence, positioning attack submarines, not to defend Chinese waters, but to threaten the approach corridors that American carriers use to enter the South China Sea. Third, watch the DF-21D and DF-26 ballistic missile exercise schedule. The carrier-killer ballistic missiles are China's ultimate answer to the problem the Reagan demonstrated. If you cannot trap a carrier with surface ships without handing its submarines an intelligence windfall, you threaten it from a range where surface ships are not needed and submarines cannot intercept. The next large-scale planned ballistic missile exercise in the South China Sea will tell us whether China believes its carrier-killer doctrine needs refinement or acceleration. For the United States, the intelligence collected during those 19 hours does not sit in a filing cabinet. It enters an active targeting database. The acoustic signatures of every Chinese vessel in that formation are now in the targeting libraries of every American fast attack submarine deployed to the Pacific. The communication protocols of the plan's fleet coordination architecture are now in the electronic warfare libraries of every American surface combatant and aircraft in the theater. The radar and sensor emission patterns of the Type 0552D, Type 054A, and Type 055 were collected at ranges and durations that no previous intelligence operation had produced. The Reagan's commanding officer gave American naval planners something that money and satellites cannot buy: ground truth, not estimated capability, not modeled performance. Actual behavior at operational tempo under the pressure of a real encounter from a fleet that believed it was the one conducting the surveillance. That ground truth will shape American naval doctrine, weapons procurement, and operational planning in the Pacific for the next decade. And China will never know exactly what was collected, which means it cannot fully account for it in its own planning. This is the asymmetry that the encirclement produced. China got a photograph. America got a blueprint. Here is where we need to step back from the fleet compositions and the acoustic signatures and the intelligence collection timelines and acknowledge what was actually happening aboard the USS Ronald Reagan during those 19 hours. There were 5,000 American sailors and naval personnel on that ship, not abstractions, not strategic assets. People, 19, 22, 25 years old, many of them on their first deployment. Many of them from towns where the South China Sea is a phrase they heard in a geography class and never thought would become the defining fact of a year of their lives. They were on watch rotations, maintaining aircraft, running engineering systems, standing radar contacts, tracking 40 Chinese warships that were getting closer and not stopping, and doing their jobs with the precision that their training demanded and the steadiness that the situation required. The officers who made the decision to stop the strike group and hold position made that decision understanding that the 5,000 people under their command were not in a simulation. The commanding officer of the Reagan, the strike group admiral, the submarine commanders holding position in the depths below, they were executing a calculated strategic demonstration under real threat conditions, with real consequences if their calculation about Chinese intentions was wrong. They were not wrong. But the fact that they were not wrong is not a guarantee that the next commanding officer, in the next encounter, facing a slightly different formation, with slightly different orders and slightly different Chinese intentions, will have the same outcome. Aboard those 40 Chinese warships, there were Chinese naval personnel doing exactly the same thing, standing watch, tracking contacts, executing the orders of commanders who answered to commanders, who answered to a political leadership that had decided this demonstration was worth the risk. Chinese sailors in their 20s, operating Type 052D destroyers in the South China Sea, are not the authors of the strategy they are executing. They are the instruments of it. And the gap between the strategy they were sent to execute and the outcome that strategy produced is not a gap those sailors will ever fully understand, because the debrief they receive will be shaped by the institutional imperatives of a military that does not benefit from honest assessments of strategic miscalculation. What the Reagan's commanding officer demonstrated in 19 hours of calculated stillness was not just tactical competence. It was a form of strategic communication that no press conference, no diplomatic note, and no congressional statement could have delivered with the same clarity. He said, "We know what you are doing. We know how you do it. We know what your ships sound like, what your communications look like, and what your formation doctrine reveals about what you cannot do. We know all of this now better than we did 19 hours ago, and we want you to think about that. The South China Sea is still contested. China's artificial island bases are still armed. The DF-21D ballistic missiles are still pointed at American carriers. The 9-dash line is still drawn on Chinese maps. 40 warships can still be put in the water and pointed at an American strike group whenever the order is given, but the order was given once. And the result was 19 hours of American intelligence collection conducted from inside the formation that was supposed to be doing the collecting. Stay with this story, because the next phase of this competition will not be decided by who has more ships, or more missiles, or more satellites. It will be decided by who has better information about the other side's actual capabilities, actual doctrines, and actual limits, and who can act on that information faster than the other side can adapt. The Reagan just answered one half of that question. The other half arrives the next time China sends 40 ships and the carrier does not stop.